Welcome, everybody, to the next episode of the RIUNIT Podcast series. Good morning if you're in Europe, good afternoon, Asia, and good evening, Australia. So, RIUNIT Research Intelligence Unit is a company that has been in around the world for the last 21 years, facilitating better cooperation between the developed and the developing world. And one of the other things we do is to try and spread information and knowledge and data, which helps everyone from large corporations to smaller ones make better sense of what's going on in the global economy and the geopolitical situation as it unfolds. Today, once again, we're very lucky to have with us Professor Howard Nicholas. Professor Howard is an economist and social scientist, retired professor in economics at the International Institute of Social Studies of the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He's got a wide range of exposure and experience in teaching around the world, and his in-depth knowledge of macroeconomics has helped to serve policymakers make better decisions in Sri Lanka and other parts of the world. It's also a great pleasure to have with us Bram Nicholas is the co-founder of Economics Training and Information Services company, ITIS. Before setting this up, Bram worked in consulting in a variety of areas, including trading, global equity, currency, commodities, and the bond markets. Bram is currently studying his PhD at Columbia University. So welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
To the podcast. Let me start with Sri Lanka, if I might make that a central point. Sri Lanka is obviously, it has been on the global radar for many reasons, and more recently, the reasons haven't been very good. The crisis that the country has been going through has essentially been one of a sovereign debt. Not new in the world of development economics, but this crisis was somewhat unique in that it gave people in Sri Lanka a taste of things that they previously only read in economics textbooks, things like galloping inflation and soaring prices, currency crisis, which eventually resulted in social unrest. And thankfully, largely a bloodless overturning of the presidential and the governing regime. Debatable, we'll get to that with our experts in a minute. Essentially, the debt restructuring is what we can start with here. A complete debt of some 51 billion external debt is out there. And the main crediting agencies include bilateral debtors such as China and India, and the multilateral agencies like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. And in recent times, the increasing use of the international sovereign bond market by successive central bank governors had further taken Sri Lanka down the line of the debt trap, unsustainable debt, and finally an economic crisis, which unfortunately has plunged millions of Sri Lankans into poverty, a situation that the country is still grappling with in order to try and get out of it. Some 1.2 million Sri Lankans at all levels and professions have already left, migrated out of the country, a phenomenon that is widely known as the brain drain. In addition, there have been numerous other hurdles that the country has had to overcome, but thankfully this year, at least on paper, there's a sign that there's some growth. 5.3% GDP growth rate in Q1, which is, by recent standards, something somewhat remarkable. But we'll try to get behind the numbers because, as I said, the country is still in a state of heightened poverty. The number of people below the poverty rate has increased by several million in the last couple of years. So let me turn first of all to Professor Howard to get your views on what happened with the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka recently in his negotiation. Could you give us a few insights on what transpired, and did Sri Lanka get a good deal in the debt restructuring negotiations? Over to you, Dr. Howard.
Thanks, Roshan. Thanks for inviting me again. It's good to be here. Nice to have a chat about these things. I wanted to start by talking of the president and the debt restructuring because I wanted to start by whose fault was all of this. And actually, it's the president's fault because when he was prime minister in the period from 2015 to 19, it was he, together with the governor of the central bank, who essentially brought Sri Lanka to this current problem of excessive debt. They borrowed somewhere like 12.5 billion in terms of the ISBs. And recently, in an interview with Professor Jayati Ghosh, what she said is that actually this was Ponzi financing on a national scale, and it was under the auspices of an IMF program. So the IMF was also there at the time that this whole debt problem was created, and they said nothing about it. They didn't reprimand the president then. And now he's in charge, together with the IMF, of restructuring the debt. You know, it's that proverbial, the fox put in to look after the chickens approach. And so for me, I think we need to start with that and never forget that, because going forward, we have to look very carefully how we can ever stop this sort of thing happening again, where essentially a regime which perhaps knows that it has a limited time frame wrecks an economy by getting it into massive debt, and then later sits back and absolves themselves of any responsibility, and worse still, they're then put in charge of essentially restructuring the debt.
But it's not just the borrowing, right? I mean,
Sorry?
It's not just the borrowing. I think this has been a focus of a lot of people to just focus on the borrowing side and not how you earn the money required to finance the interest payments and also in the end pay off the debt. Because we see so many people just talking about, you know, what's the amount of debt, what's the amount of interest that needs to be paid. And that's the question we also had for the current president when he was, the current president when he was in power in 2015 to 19, is what was there done to actually earn the foreign exchange required to pay the interest on this external debt? You know, where was that? Because we know that exports did very little. In fact, since 2018, they haven't moved. It's still the same level of exports as we had back then. So if you're not growing exports, and we know that tourism and remittances are really volatile and unreliable, then how can you expect to, you know, have a sustainable debt situation when you just keep issuing more and more foreign debt without doing anything to improve the earnings?
I think that's a really important point, and we have to come back to that when we discuss the IMF package, because that's one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, that's actually missing from the IMF package, as it has been missing in all its packages all over the world, and that is foreign exchange earning by countries. Hence, they end up getting back into the same problem that brought them to the IMF. Now, that is actually known by all the experiences of all the countries that have gone to the IMF. They're repeat offenders, but usually the story is they're repeat offenders because they're corrupt, they don't do the right things, they haven't learned economics at Harvard, etc., etc. But we know that the IMF was actually set up to do precisely what it's doing, to indebt developing countries and make sure they remain exactly where they are. In other words, the IMF was set up to maintain a division of labor that was set up under colonization. One part of the world is producing raw materials and basic foodstuffs, and the other part of the world is producing manufactures. And the part that is producing the raw materials and basic foodstuffs essentially remains impoverished. The other part essentially benefits from all the value added, the high value added that manufacturing brings with it, and the technology developments. Now, the IMF and the World Bank have been very, very important in that process. So when we say, why are they a failure? In fact, they're not a failure. IMF is remarkably successful at doing precisely what they were supposed to do. The one thing that they were really supposed not to allow to happen in developing countries was industrialization. And there, I bring you to an amazing paper written by two IMF people. And the title of the paper is The Policy That Shall Have No Name. You know, like the Harry Potter Voldemort thing. We don't mention his name. In the IMF, you're not allowed to mention industrialization policy. Especially in the world we're living in today, where the advanced countries have gone completely crazy with promoting industrialization. This is absurd that the IMF still maintains that position that developing countries are not allowed to embark on industrialization policies. For those who are interested, the paper was written by two individuals, Sharif and Hazanov. Sharif and Hazanov. And they wrote it in 2019. And they made clear that in the IMF, in the corridors of the IMF, you're not allowed to mention industrialization policy. Why? When in fact, that has been the basis of all countries becoming rich.
Well, now you see the rich countries actually reintroducing a lot of industrial policy, isn't it? So
exactly.
Is the IMF even watching that? Or are they thinking when they see that?
That's a very important point. So if we're then taking this back to its origin, can I ask you guys? So I've heard this argument mentioned many times historically from Churchill, when it was apparently agreed that Britain, after the Second World War, would withdraw the frontiers of its imperial presence in the world. But the understanding was that America would have free access to these markets. So a form of straight up colonialism, in your face colonialism, replaced by what later became known as, economic colonialism, neo-colonialism. In that context, Bretton Woods and the IMF, it has been said, it has been set up as an extension of American foreign policy. For people who may not be aware of how the internal mechanisms of the IMF operate, would either of you shed some light on how the contributions made to the IMF by different countries around the world affects their voting rights, etc.? What I'm trying to ask is, to what extent is it true that the IMF is indeed an extension of American foreign policy?
Well, actually, Professor Ghosh stated this very clearly in an interview that she had recently, that it is an extension of US global policy. But I think what you need to do is to look at the voting rights. And the voting rights are supposed to reflect economic and political power. Now, obviously, that has changed dramatically, and China should be at least on a par with the US, and if not on a par, marginally below them in terms of voting power. But in fact, China's voting power has barely shifted. Similarly, countries like India and Brazil and so on, whose GDP increases warrant that they have far more voting power, but they haven't been granted this. And the real question is why? And the answer is quite simply the US, together with its allies, want to keep control of this one instrument that has been extremely important to them to maintain their position and the global division of labor that they created, and which the IMF helps perpetuate. Now, one thing I ask when people say, well, this is all conspiracy theory, Howard. I say to them, well, who appoints the head of the IMF? Who nominates? And who has veto rights? Well, the US has veto rights. The Europeans do the nominating, and the US has veto rights. Who appoints the president of the World Bank? The US. Now, are you trying to tell me they're doing this because of global benevolence? Come on. But believe it or not, I've met lots of business people, especially in Sri Lanka, that say, yeah, we need them to run our affairs for us because we're so corrupt. As if the Americans are not corrupt. Washington is one cesspit of corruption. You have endless numbers of people, insiders, repeating the same thing. Yet somehow we are so corrupt, we have no right to have a say in this extremely important institution, the IMF.
But I guess
and I think that's
it also comes back a bit to, even if you take out that corruption element, to say that the US has the best interests of Sri Lanka at heart. I've always found that sort of comes from that neoclassical view where you produce coconuts, I'll produce computer chips, we trade, and we're both off the best we can be, So there's no competition, there's no conflict of interest, because as long as we specialize in what we're naturally good at, whatever that means, we're going to be trading partners, and that's going to be the best world possible. I think that's what this really comes down to, right? We could also argue that the US is corrupt and their government is as corrupt as the Sri Lankan government. But I think more fundamental is this view that it's so strong, this neoclassical view that this is the way trade works, this is the way international economics works, that supposedly everyone specializes in what they're good at and then starts trading. So then the question is, why is every single advanced country getting into semiconductor production? What are they doing? Are they insane? Have they not read Adam Smith? Have they not read Ricardo? And where's the IMF to tell them that they're all bonkers for doing it? And that's the absurdity of this, where you get the economists here, but also, I guess, all over the world, sort of with these blinders on, not looking at what's actually happening, or saying that somehow, they're doing that, but in spite of that, they're still successful. It's a bit silly that they're all getting into semiconductor manufacturing, but in spite of that, they'll still be fine.
They haven't read the textbooks, obviously.
You would think.
Nor have they visited Haiti, for example, where the US told them to buy their rice from the US rather than attempt to become a bit more independent in their agriculture. And I think it was the 90s when they were very seriously hit, and people were eating mud cakes reportedly at that time. So this comparative advantage theory doesn't seem very credible in reality or in practice.
Yeah.
Just going back to the IMF and its treatment of debt, Roshan.
Yes, sir.
I'm reminded of a really good interview done by Professor Varoufakis. You remember Professor Varoufakis is the previous finance minister of Greece. Well, he was the finance minister when Greece, basically the whole problem of default erupted in Greece, and the progressive government was brought into power, and he was appointed as the finance minister. And in one of his interviews, because he was particularly angry with the Germans for their insistence on draconian cuts in welfare expenditure and so on, he pointed out that if the IMF had applied the same rules to Germany in the aftermath of the Second World War, when Germany was bankrupt and owed a lot of international creditors money, then they would not be at this table sitting opposite him. He said they would be a third world country. And that is because the IMF was told by the Americans to use different standards for the Germans. And what he pointed out, and it was echoed the other day by Professor Janati Ghosh, is half of the debt was completely forgiven. And the other half, the interest on it was capped at 5% and linked to export earnings, such that the US in particular, who was owed most of that debt, had an interest in giving Germany access to its markets so that it could earn the foreign exchange to repay some of the debt. And Professor Ghosh said, if we use that as the gold standard, no developing country would have problems today. And the question she didn't answer is, why don't they do that? Why don't they do that? And I go back to my point, is their job is to keep developing countries exactly where they are and block their industrialization. And you can see that in virtually every action, including now the IMF package. Look at the package. It's all about the budget and raising taxes, privatizing industries which shouldn't be privatized. Okay, but where is the discussion, as Bram said a short while ago, where is the discussion of how Sri Lanka is going to earn the foreign exchange to service its debt? They know perfectly well Sri Lanka is not going to be able to do that given the current policies, and will at some point down the road, and here I'm going to take a bet with them, some point down the road, there'll be another foreign exchange crisis, like there is repeated foreign exchange crises for all developing countries working with the IMF. It's not an accident. It's not their stupidity. It's deliberate. That is the way they have maintained control. But what we do in Sri Lanka is we say, oh, it's all about corruption. It's our fault.
Yeah, actually, you're right, Professor. So Sri Lanka has had a relationship since 1965. I've heard people in Sri Lanka say foolishly that Sri Lanka is in love with the IMF, that they keep getting together and splitting up like lovers. I couldn't think of a worse analogy than that, to be honest.
Yeah.
How that intercourse has played out between Sri Lanka and the IMF. But if I might be mistaken, it might be 17 or 18 times in that area that they've gone for various extended fund facilities and standby agreements. So your prediction is probably spot on, and I certainly, for one, wouldn't bet against that.
And what they're going to do,
Question is when,
Roshan, is they're
right?
going to again blame corruption. I think I may have told you that I visited Kenya recently at the behest of an NGO. The riots just after I left had nothing to do with me, contrary to what
You say.
a lot of people have been saying. Again, what is incredible is how fast the BBC, CNN, the Western media jumped in and emphasized corruption. And the young people, of course, are angry with their politicians because they are corrupt. That is the system the West has created in most developing countries, because that when you have nothing at all, no economic dynamism, you get into corruption, you get into drug dealing, you get into all the nefarious activities because there's nothing else for you. And then what we do is we say, oh, these people have corruption in their DNA, as if the West doesn't have it, as if Japan doesn't have it, as if China doesn't have it. But no, we have the corruption. And it's very easy. I noticed how the BBC immediately jumped on the fact that the Rajapaksas were corrupt. And they only interviewed people who actually went on and on and on about the corruption, because they must always blame everything except what has been created globally, a global division of labor to block industrialization. Tomorrow, if that changes, the corruption would start to disappear. At least it would not impact the country as badly as it does currently.
Well, and I think someone made this point the other day that, what was the success of Singapore? And they said they eliminated corruption. Now, first of all, I would not really go so far as to say that, but I think they did minimize it by paying their government servants a very high salary. But then the question is, obviously, how can you suddenly pay them such a high salary? And that all leads us back to what I think you're trying to argue is you need to get this growth story in. You need to start growing the economy so that you can also start paying your government servants more money, and you can actually start reducing, let's say, the damaging type of corruption. You can probably never eliminate it. I mean, I don't think we know of any country where it's actually been eliminated, even though people would like to pretend that in some countries that has happened.
Scandinavia has a fairly decent reputation. I believe they're probably nearer to the goal than many others, certainly nearer than Western Europe, right? I don't have any insights.
Well,
secondary sources.
Brahm and I can give you chapter and verse about corruption in the Netherlands. Okay, I mean, there's one example of corruption in the Netherlands where it was so bad, they had to close down the investigation. It was something called the building fraud. And when they started investigating the fraud, in each and every province in the Netherlands, they found that not just the party in power was involved, but everybody was involved. So they just shut down the investigation. And the image conveyed to everybody is, no, we are not corrupt. It's just those savages in developing countries who are corrupt. They are always putting their money in. It's this racism and the caricature of racism that has always been there. Africans are, let's say, the idea is Africans are always prone to corruption, etc.
No, you're absolutely right, because in Edward Said's book, I'm sure you've come across it, Orientalism.
Yeah.
He really delves into how the literature over the last few centuries has caricatured the melancholy Asians and the phlegmatic Africans, and justified policies in that. Today is much more subtle, and it's in the media, as you say. People die in Palestine, but in Israel they're murdered. So the language is subtle these days, but the underlying prejudice hasn't gone away, right? That's essentially what you're saying.
And actually what I wanted to do, Roshan, is link that to the proposal we have on the table now for debt restructuring. This macro-linked bond, which the research institution Verite calls the governance-linked bond. Now, the premise of that is that we are so corrupt, we need to invent something to put a lid on that corruption. And what they've decided to do is to link the debt to good governance. Okay, that's what this macro linked.
Governance, right?
Yes. And the question is, who decides on the good governance? And there, Verite comes up, and I believe it's now going to be incorporated into the government's agreement. It's going to be that any future government has to raise taxation to the level recommended by the IMF, which is 15% of GDP. Currently, it's at 9% of GDP. I mean, this is this point made by the left politician, the video that we have. What's her name? I forget.
Is it that German lady?
No, the Sri Lankan person who.
Oh, right. Yeah, I don't have that video already, but
her name is Arugalingam. Arugalingam. And she said, how on earth are we ever going to raise tax to GDP by this level from 9% to 15% of GDP when already the destructive effect of that taxation on ordinary people is almost unbearable?
But isn't it so in the way that they're doing it?
Yes, that's also the way, but it's very well known in developing countries like Sri Lanka to raise that tax burden is very, very difficult. You can only raise it once the economy is really starting to motor, as it were. But here's the important thing. If I put this qualification in there, remember there are two criteria for the haircut and the interest, the coupon interest. One is growth. So if Sri Lanka grows by more than a certain amount, then the haircut is reduced.
Well, I believe it's the dollar amount. So you don't just need growth, you would also need the rupee to remain.
But it's not in the agreement. It's only growth. It's only growth they have.
I thought I saw that it was linked to specific dollar amounts of GDP.
Oh, yeah, right. You're right. I think so. But then the second thing is they say, but this is conditional upon good governance. So even if you have high growth, if they say, but that wasn't the result of reducing taxes or increasing taxes to this level, then they can say, therefore, we don't need an extra haircut. You understand the catch now that is in there. And this is why Verite's proposal has been supported by BlackRock. Imagine that, BlackRock looking after the interests of Sri Lanka, the IMF, and it's also been highlighted in a special article by Bloomberg. So the question you have to ask yourself is, why are they doing all of this? Do they really love Sri Lanka to such an extent that they're so worried that we're doing the right thing? Of course not. Because this is the greatest insurance policy for any investor, anyone buying the bonds, because sure as anything, Sri Lanka is never going to achieve those good governance targets. Absolutely no chance that it's going to do that. And the attempt to do it is going to destroy any government. So it's actually this poison chalice that is being left there. And what it is doing is actually determining the macro policy of any future government. They're caught. They're caught. It doesn't matter if you vote in the MPP. If they don't adopt the same strategy, then they're going to end up paying huge amounts of money to the foreign bondholders. Okay? So I think it's really important to look into greater detail into that, and any future government that comes in has to renegotiate that, has to say that that was negotiated by a corrupt government that actually got us into that position. And it has to be renegotiated because it constrains the entire macro policy framework of the government. So why the opposition, or some members of the opposition, also praised the president is precisely because they were also part of his party at that time and responsible for getting us into this debt problem. So now
From
they
what
have
you're
to.
saying, it sounds like sort of the democracy is slowly disappearing, isn't it? So
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
government won't have any control of the macro
Absolutely.
situation anymore due to this, but also things like the central bank bill. Remember, we discussed that many times, where they will now also not have the ability to, let's say, when things get bad in a global economic downturn, that they cannot print to finance the budget deficit, because that's normally what countries do, right? They get into trouble in, let's say, global recession, maybe another COVID or whatever. And then, well, we saw it in 2020. All governments went for a budget deficit.
He has a talent at jumping in on meetings.
Ask her position on the debt problem.
She's
There was-
given up.
There was actually one video I wanted to show you guys related to this, and like to get your response from it.
There's one sentence in an article by Professor Kanchana Ruanpura which appealed to me, and I thought I'd read it out. Laws and procedures for responsible borrowing and lending need to be ensured to protect citizens and communities, in particular against corrupt, predatory and odious debts. Professor Ghosh?
Yes, I think this is actually, it's a very important point. You know, we had discussions yesterday that Martin Guzman, who was the finance minister of Argentina, was present. And he pointed out that in Argentina, he brought in a bill that actually requires parliamentary permission before taking sovereign bonds.
Wow.
And that's, why shouldn't we? Why should the people not know? And even decide whether borrowing is even required. And why are you taking it, on what terms, what do you intend to do with it?
Isn't reflecting the will of the people, but perhaps the people are also incompetent, and you know, nobody in Sri Lanka basically can decide what is good for Sri Lanka. So you need foreigners like the IMF to tell you exactly what to do. I mean, that's what this whole story seems to be about, and I think this is why Professor Ghosh.
This is a very important point, Bram.
Yeah.
I was planning to bring the discussion into the political realm, but I think it's kind of, entwined so deeply. I mean, one of the observations I would have is that having, worked in Sri Lanka for past so many years, the level of influence is a very kind word that international aid agencies and donors have on local think tanks is pervasive. And many of these, unfortunately, I wouldn't want to mention names, are basically rubber stamping the policies that the developed world would like to pursue and implement in the developing world. So from our point of view, this obviously is a form of corruption. Would you agree? Where you get various agencies to promote something which is not in the national interest of the country where you hail from, and this isn't limited to the third world. I mean, I recently read a report on U.S. Congress. The number of congressmen who receive funding and donations from non-US countries is very, very high, more than 50%. And this again compromises their ability to put the US people and the US interests before the interests of foreign parties or other institutions who are obviously funding them openly or through covert means. And here you mentioned BlackRock, and these types of firms are way more powerful than governments. And when I travel in Asia, I've seen many of the large utility companies that are owned by, which I thought were owned by the governments, are actually owned by companies listed at the New York Stock Exchange, Dow Jones, etc. An example is the Maldives, which I was very proud to meet the CEO of the world's largest seaplane fleet anywhere in the world. And that's in the Maldives, an amazing fleet, amazing operation. So I said to him, he must be very proud. He wasn't Maldivian, he was Sri Lankan, by the way. But I said, you guys must be very proud having this thing. But then he said, we are, but as of recently, it's owned by BlackRock, who are now trading it on the New York Stock Exchange or in the US. So this ownership of developing world assets and utilities by private entities is a trend which is very recent and worrying. I think you mentioned the Magnificent Seven, right, in the US, the huge firms who tend to own everything, grab everything. So it seems to be all about influence, the way that setting things up. Sri Lanka is an example, excellent example. So if Brahm, you and Professor can give some feedback on it, I would like to ask you guys a few more questions on the independence of political regimes in the current contemporary world, and not just in the developing world, but with the elections that are happening in Europe and the US, we can turn the spotlight onto that as well. So what are your thoughts that corruption is an essential component of the IMF? And I think the IMF and many of these super large corporations, their interests are anyway not conflicting, if not completely synchronized. So in the face of all this, what can a Sri Lanka do to mitigate or to sidestep the actual reality of the world we live in? I know this seems like a very loaded and a tough question, and you could win the Nobel Peace Prize if you can answer it. I'll certainly nominate you myself.
Then I'm not bothering to answer this question. No, I mean, comes a bit back to what I said before, right? Is this view that somehow if all countries just specialize and trade with each other, that it's going to be the best possible scenario for everyone. I think this is where you saw the East Asian countries, the successful ones, they realized that this was nonsense. This was not the way they were going to develop. And they actively went after industries that were very important in the advanced countries. And so, I mean, we're talking of South Korea, Japan before it, and Taiwan, Singapore, all of them got into industries that directly took away business from, let's say, the US and Europe. And so you have to recognize that when you're dealing with a so-called international body like the IMF that is actually representing these countries that are your current or future competitors, you should have your own plan ready. You should not let your strategy be dictated by that, because basically you've lost before you even start the game.
But you see, you're in a tough situation because these future competitors are currently your clients, right? Your customer base.
Exactly. So you have to make it worth their while. And that's the genius of like the Asian tigers. They, in a way, were one of the first to really do this in a big way, is where they set up a whole policy framework to attract the Western manufacturers to their countries to come and produce them. So when you start doing that, then suddenly you create a situation where those companies actually have a vested interest in you succeeding, because they've set up their production there. So like, actually, Japan was even earlier than the Asian tigers to do this, where they invited Ford to set up their manufacturing plants in Japan. And that's actually how Toyota got the technical capabilities to develop. And when they did that, they also got the US on their side to open up a lot of markets to Japanese exports, including Ford cars, which were being made in Japan. So there are a number of strategies where actually the successful East Asian countries have managed to balance this thing, where obviously these are your competitors, but there is a way to bring them onto your side in some way. So you see it with Vietnam now. I mean, look at all the companies from Samsung to Intel to Apple that are all producing in Vietnam. Do you think they want to see Vietnam have a currency crisis? Do you think they don't have an interest in opening up markets to Vietnamese exports? I mean, that is the critical thing that they have done. Of course, meanwhile, they've now started developing their own companies. And that's where I think there's never full control of, let's say, the foreigners, where they might want to block this development of the domestic companies. At a certain point, it's unstoppable. You know, the technology is transferred and the domestic companies start actively competing with the foreign companies.
This reminds me of, I think, the 80s. I think, Bram, you might be a little young to remember this, Howard might. I think, wasn't there a campaign against... I'm pretty sure, actually. There was a campaign against, I think, the Ghetto Blaster by Sony. In the US, the Congress famously smashed one. They basically felt Japan was getting too big for its boots. Howard will probably remember the details probably better than me as well.
Memory's fading.
Yeah, but there is a sense. So I think what Bram said is very important. So can BRICS, so BRICS, my issue with the BRICS is, for a country like Sri Lanka, BRICS represents the sources of Sri Lanka's imports rather than export destinations, right? What can a country like Sri Lanka leverage when our exports are dependent almost entirely on European and US markets? So there's a huge challenge, a balancing act, if you will, right?
Before I get to that, Prashant, I wanted to come back to your original question about what we can do to block foreign influence. And then Bram, what he started to say, or what he actually did say, was the most important thing is for us to get the growth machine going, the export-oriented growth machine. And I think this should be repeated ad nauseum, because again, the entire narrative is about corruption. How do we stop corruption? How do we stop now foreign influence? You know, let's assume we have NPP coming to power. Let's assume they actually mean what they say about stopping corruption. Fine. Let's assume they even stop foreign influence. Let's assume that they're so committed to this national cause that they kick the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation out of the presidential secretariat, which they should do. I mean, which they should do. This is absurd. This is an insult to Sri Lanka and probably reflects the nature of our current president better than anything else does. But what I'm saying, what I'm asking the NPP is, what is your strategy for growing the economy and earning foreign exchange? What is that strategy? Now, my hope is they don't want to put their cards on the table. You know, I mean, if I were them, I would also say, no, we're just emphasizing corruption. But my hope is that underlying all of this, they actually have a coherent and aggressive policy to develop Sri Lanka's production base and export-oriented production base. Because otherwise, unlike the current regime, they will be far more vilified than this regime, because this regime actually does represent the elites and also the foreign elites. I mean, most people are not under any illusions about where the sympathies of the current president lies. But with the JVP, the expectations are really high. The expectations are that they're really going to do something to improve the lot of the people. And the question is whether that's only wishful thinking and whether they actually believe, let's say, the sort of stuff that Verite is coming out with. If you just eliminate corruption, maybe these new macro-linked bonds are the way forward. If they really believe that, I'm afraid they're in trouble. You know, I would rather say, okay, we eliminate a lot of the gratuitous signs of foreign influence in our country. We limit that. But more important to our project is this: promoting the industrial base of our country, promoting the whole production base. I'm sorry to say that that is not there at the moment. At least I'm not privy to it. I haven't seen them say anything about this. And I'm extremely worried that they're going to get into, let's say, you know, this is a national project, we don't want foreigners interfering, etc., etc. But they won't actually do anything to change the dynamic of the economy. And we will go into another trajectory towards another foreign exchange crisis.
Very important, I think. I completely agree with you. In fact, where I would disagree is that my fear with the party coming in with a completely different ideology is that they will try to do too much before cleaning your own house. So eliminating or minimizing corruption itself will probably deliver at least 10-15% boost to the economy from plugging the leakages, right? All the illicit things that happen. If they can successfully manage that phase, which I believe is the most important, then the second step of implementing the policy will have even a higher success rate. Because on the flip side of it, what could be worse than someone who's equally corrupt, is less competent, hasn't been to Harvard, etc., and implementing a set of policies which may be, innovative or brave or new, or certainly going against the grain, which is bound to be disastrous. So this is, I think, I've spoken to many people, and there is a tendency, a fear factor that if you don't clean your house, then there's no point renovating it. And I think I share that concern with you there.
But the question is, how do you clean your house? I mean, how do you actually start reducing corruption? I mean, first of all, how do we even quantify corruption? And then second, how do you actually sustainably start getting rid of it? I think this is the whole point, is, listen, if you actually want people to be less dependent on corruption for their income, that income has to come from somewhere else. And that income has to start being dependent on a vibrant economy with a vibrant private sector and, you know, the taxes that come from that. Whereas what they seem to be saying, the MPP, is, no, we're going to do it the other way around. You first get rid of corruption somehow, and then we start growing the economy because of the elimination of corruption. Now, as Howard said, I don't know if they actually believe that or have another plan up their sleeve to actually grow the economy. But let's say then it's not even the MPP, but a lot of Sri Lankan economists and, well, the IMF for that matter, that are of the opinion when you get your governance in order, when you eliminate corruption, that somehow grows the economy.
But don't you feel, Bram, that the Sri Lankan economy, the location, the sheer value of real estate, the tourism, the hard-working and bright private sector here, I mean, the place is wired for growth. It's an underachieving country. Upon gaining independence from the British, Sri Lanka was probably only second to Japan in all of Asia. My sense is that governments tend to stifle growth, and they don't need to do that much in order to facilitate the growth to take place. I don't like to quote the World Bank, sorry, but the World Bank famously said the sum of the parts don't add up to the total in Sri Lanka because of all the leakages. So there is a case to be made for starting with eliminating corruption, right?
Yeah, but let me put it this way. So I think now I've heard it quite a lot, that people generally agree that our Premadasa's time, so from 1989 to 94, when he was assassinated, that was probably one of the best periods for the Sri Lankan economy in the post-war period.
Right.
So let's for a minute accept that. Is there something to show us that corruption was the lowest during that time and governance was the highest? I mean, that would be a really difficult thing to argue, wouldn't it? I mean, there are, in fact, so many, let's say, dodgy things about the way that government went about things, that it would be really difficult to say that, you know, this was a transparent and proper government that was handling things correctly. In fact, nothing of the sort. But the whole point, what can we see was the difference? This government of Premadasa was aggressively promoting export-oriented manufacturing. That's it. It had nothing to do with lessening corruption. And so that is the whole point of this, is, you know, even forget about quantifying corruption and all of that, because it's just not possible. There is an argument to be made that because Sri Lanka is already has a weak economy, that corruption is doing more damage than it otherwise would. But to say that it's the source of all the problems, I think, is turning the whole picture around, where it's actually a consequence of a weak system, where basically the only way people earn a decent living is to take a bit off the top. And that's not to condone the corruption, obviously there are cases where it's out of control and they're just being greedy. But again, going back to that example of Premadasa's success, I don't think you could argue that that was because corruption was somehow lessened and good governance was introduced.
So actually, that manufacturing thrust continued through the 90s as well, I believe. And I know the Board of Investment in the early days and even just before used to go around the world promoting Sri Lanka and getting investment. And they were somewhat successful even despite the civil conflict, raging on. They managed to get all kinds of brands to Sri Lanka, global sports brands to fashion, high street fashion brands, etc. So you're not troubled by the fact that this was essentially turning Sri Lanka into a bit of a sweatshop because it was all taking place in the free trade zones, right?
That's right, yeah. I mean, it's, first of all, always a stage of industrialization, right? You can't just immediately jump to the end and say, right, we're going to manufacture rockets. You have to start somewhere, and that's the way all countries have done it. They usually start with manufacturing garments and textiles and then slowly move into higher value added products, slowly become more productive, and that's when you really see wages of the ordinary person rise. The sweatshops, it's definitely something that is, something that comes with industrializing, I mean, in a lot of cases. And I think that is perhaps something that's unavoidable. But the question is then, what's the alternative? If you're not industrializing, we now see that a result of not going down that industrialization path has led us to, what are we at now? 26% poverty in the country. I mean, I think those people would rather be working in one of Premadasa's factory and earning a decent wage than having not enough money to pay for 3 meals in the day. You know what I mean? So it's also a case of alternatives.
I agree with you. And I think some of those who started out are doing pretty well. I know many companies have also looked at setting up regionally and have expanded within the SAARC region. So you're right, it does give birth. But then what you have to say about the fact that the world is a lot more globalized now, these companies are very footloose. So, at the blink of an eye, they will relocate in Vietnam or Bangladesh. They are actually, right? So are the certain
Sri Lankan companies or?
No, I mean, your, MNSs, for example, who used to be here in the free trade zones of Sri Lanka,
right,
have since moved out to lower wage destinations.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it was in the blink of an eye. I mean, it's pretty costly and time consuming for a company to just move their production like that. So I'm guessing, I mean, I don't know the inside workings of those companies, but I'm guessing it was a long and difficult decision. But in the end, you have basically 20 years in Sri Lanka of incentives disappearing slowly, infrastructure crumbling, all these things that usually attract manufacturers in the first place and keep them there are, not sustained. And there's no dynamism in the economy to also give them the idea that this is a place where they're going to earn more and more profits in the future. So, I mean, if I were them after, I don't know how long, probably 20 years of disappointment, then yeah, after a while, I start considering other options because they're probably making massive losses.
So I heard that the Apple components are made in several dozen countries, which again is an illustration that maybe also raw materials, but the cost of labor is a very important factor within it. But yeah, you're obviously right. May not be the blink of an eye. Howard, any thoughts on the person? Can we replicate the Privatization era now?
What I think is just, again, building on that discussion, you see, look at the difference between Bangladesh and Vietnam. Now, as far as I know, and I may be mistaken with this, Bangladesh is quite content to remain at the level of garments and textiles, with some niche areas in garments and textiles. Vietnam is not. I mean, it started with garments and textiles, there's no doubt, and it still is a big garments and textile producer and exporter. But as our studies have shown, what Vietnam did is diversified the manufacturing base. They shifted into higher and higher value-added products with more and more value added by local companies. Now, that is not so obvious at the moment because of the huge role that Samsung plays. But if you go to Vietnam and you actually see with your own eyes, you can see lots of Vietnamese companies themselves starting to appear and moving up the value chain. Okay, so we know there's a car company which produces EVs called VinFast. Now, even though their launch of the first EV in the US was a bit of a debacle, the point is it reminds me of Hyundai and their first cars, which were absolute rubbish. But slowly, that experience allowed them to develop and then move into more and more advanced manufacturing. And we're seeing that. And that is the crucial thing, is there a leadership that is prepared to move down that road and resist all the pressures that are put on them by foreign governments and foreign companies? And that, I think, is actually very, very difficult. Not only that, but also all the people that come back with their qualifications from Western universities, from the Oxfords, from the Cambridge, the Harvards, the Yales, actually they're Trojan horses. Because essentially at the drop of a hat, they're going to immediately, yes, it's the budget deficit is the problem, because that's all they're taught. The budget deficit. And
but
it's repeated.
Doesn't these include us? Are we heretics then?
Actually, the point is we've lost that ability to think critically. And I think this is what is happening, even in the Western universities for their own people. They've lost that ability to think critically. Now, all we do, and we have done many, many times when we're faced with people who say, the whole problem is the budget deficit. The IMF says it. All the various think tanks in Sri Lanka say it, and we just have one table, which I think we will show. We show the reduction, the massive reduction in the budget deficit from 1980 to the present, and what has happened to the trade balance. Where is the trade balance today? I think it's near the first, isn't it, Bram? Near the first. That one, number 2, that's it. Can you see that?
Yes.
Look at the budget deficit. In the J.R. Jayawardena period, it was 15.5% of GDP. We come down to the Rajapaksa Sirisena, that is Ranil Wickremesinghe, and we see, look at the trade deficit, the right-hand column, barely moving. So if the budget deficit was really the problem, we should have seen the trade imbalance go less than half. But it hasn't moved. And that is what I don't understand, is these are intelligent people. They build sophisticated macroeconomic models, etc., but a very simple table like this, they don't get. They can't understand that actually the data does not support what they're saying. It's just that a lot of business people love to blame the government for everything. Yeah, the government shouldn't be running a budget deficit. It's all bad. Don't forget, for at least the last 15 to 20 years, prior to the last couple of years, the IMF used to tell everyone, and still does in Sri Lanka, that it's printing money that has caused all the problems. But because they can't find any evidence for that, and I have challenged them openly, and I have challenged all their people who repeat that to show me the evidence, they have now stopped that.
Well,
They've now
the
dropped that.
central bank itself came out with a report 2 months ago that it was actually not printing that had caused the inflation in 2021, but costs of production. So that was the supply side shocks coming from the global economy, as well as the exchange rate collapsing, which we know have nothing to do with printing. So they themselves actually admitted it. But I don't know why then the IMF is still congratulating them on something they obviously...
And Bram, the governor, shortly after that, I don't know, I don't think he reads his own reports.
Probably.
He said that actually we have brought inflation down by controlling the money supply in an interview with Darren.
Show him his own report.
And, you know, the problem is with this, Roshan, that underlying the whole IMF package and the whole debt restructuring is the idea that it was the budget deficit which was the problem and a lack of revenue. So when we go even into the budget deficit itself, the main culprit is the increase in interest payments. But nowhere is the IMF talking about that. Nowhere is anyone talking about that. I think we have another chart on that, isn't it, Ram? Where we just show very simply
Which
that
one?
it's the composition. I think it's near the bottom. No, go down a bit. That one, number 9. Okay. Look at current expenditure by category. And incidentally, the IMF's own report said that non-interest expenditure in Sri Lanka is not abnormal. It's actually slightly lower than the developing country average. The problem is interest payments. Why doesn't the IMF want to focus on that? Answer is because they've now forced Sri Lanka to pass legislation where all deficits are funded by issuing commercial debt, which is going to boost interest payments massively.
Yeah, so I think the way that they say that the government will improve its debt sustainability, the IMF says, is by improving the primary budget balance.
Yeah.
And that excludes the interest payments.
Yes.
Would we be right to assume that most of these interest payments can be attributed to the ISBs rather than the bilateral loans that Sri Lanka has
Actually,
taken?
this is government's current expenditure, and this includes both domestic interest payments and interest payments on foreign debt as well.
Yeah.
So this is the total. But what my point, the point
The
I
market
wanted,
rates are much higher than the bilateral rates, right?
Yeah.
But Rohan has a point, yeah, because this is the chart we also have, that the ISPs are costing in terms of interest a disproportionate amount of ridiculous proportions. So the actual outstanding ISP debt only accounts for 36% of the total external debt.
Wow.
Yet their share of interest paid is 70%.
This is an eye-opener, actually, Bram. Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very important.
So,
You know, the point here, Roshan, is this,
yeah.
that all of these discussions, bar very few, are all based on assumptions. There's no supporting evidence given ever. It's like, we know the government is corrupt. We know that it's corruption underlying the budget deficit. We know the budget deficit causes the trade imbalance and foreign exchange crisis. We simply say to everyone, show us the evidence. Simple. It doesn't have to be complicated, because if you build a macroeconometric model, you can fudge everything. You just introduce dummy variables and change time periods and so on. Everybody knows that any macroeconometric model usually lends itself to being corrupted.
You're saying, show us the empirical evidence, right?
We say, simple chart, simple table. We follow, in that sense, The Economist magazine. I don't know if you read that with any regularity. They always just come up with one chart, one table, sometimes two charts, and to make the point, because it should be in-your-face type of evidence. Now, the IMF gets away with murder when they go around saying it's all the fault of the budget deficit. Show us. Show us. Oh, we have sophisticated econometric models. Yeah, but they can't show you with a simple chart or a simple table. We've now given you a couple of simple tables and a chart. Now, my greater difficulty with this is we've got all these people coming back trained in the West, trained in conventional universities, also people trained in Sri Lanka, all reading the same textbooks. And they have to actually repeat stuff that they can't find empirical evidence for. So it's become a religion. It's a religious statement that they're making. You can see verite and this macro-linked bond, or what they call the government's linked bond, is based precisely on this. There's no evidence to support the basis for that. They have never provided any evidence. They say, oh, we've studied 15, 17 countries, and it's always true that the more corrupt ones always have to go back to the IMF. Where? Yeah. Where is your evidence for that? Let's just take Sri Lanka as our best example. Where is the budget deficit linked to our trade imbalance? Because it's our trade imbalance that has caused our foreign exchange crisis. Where is that evidence? They never provide it. What they do is they adopt a mantra, which then they get congratulated by the IMF. Oh, these are very serious people. These are great people. In other words, they're actually doing the bidding of the foreigners. And if you look at the governance-linked bond, this is a gift. I mean, these guys must be laughing. They must be thinking, wow, we've got these insiders working for us. Who would have thought they could come up with such a brilliant thing? Because remember, before Verite came with its proposal, the only thing they were going to link it to was GDP growth. That was all. But now Verite comes with this other thing of governance, where even if the GDP growth indicates that they should take a bigger haircut than they're currently taking, they can always say, but the governance indicators means that we don't have to take a bigger haircut. You understand? And that's why BlackRock is euphoric. Of course it is.
Well, I think this is what the Professor Ghosh was pointing out is, she was arguing that the current policies that are part of what the IMF is saying the government should do are actually depressing growth. So with these macro linked bonds, with lower growth, I believe the haircut is bigger, right? And with higher growth, the haircut is smaller.
Yeah.
So now what she effectively said is that with these policies, which are so-called good governance policies, if the growth is lower, the good governance will compensate for that and keep the haircut at a very low level, because the lower growth should actually make the haircut bigger. But because it's good governance that, or accidentally caused growth to be lower, the haircut doesn't need to be any bigger. So that's why she was saying that this is totally ridiculous. I mean, this is all based on the assumption that just because you have good governance, you'll get high growth, low inflation, and, you know, perfect recovery.
Guys, so what if we do away with the barber altogether? Professor Yanis, earlier this year on one of our webinars, suggested that Sri Lanka could have defaulted and negotiated with the bilateral and the multilateral creditors separately, rather than be prepped to go back with the credit card and borrow more money. And as you said, Howard, you know, place your bets on when the next default will be as well, right? Inevitable. What would you guys say to such a proposition?
I'm in total agreement with it. I think in the first place, Sri Lanka shouldn't have defaulted. I have no idea why the president at that time took Sri Lanka into default when there were plenty of options. So, you know, I'm still asking that question to every policymaker I can possibly ask it to. But now that there has been that default, Professor Ghosh asked a very good question. She said, why do you need to appease the ISB holders? Are you going to go back to the capital markets again, given your bad experience now? You know, and I think in principle, I'm in agreement, but don't forget that a number of countries in the end have been forced under the legal process in the US, when a case has been filed against the defaulting country, then awards have been made, which is tantamount to the sequestration of assets of the country. So there are a number of problems there. She did mention that they're actually trying to work towards what is called a Chapter 11 for countries, that is protection of assets in the event of a default, but it's not there yet. So I think Sri Lanka was in a bind, but there are a number of things that she did suggest in that interview, which I think Sri Lanka should support for the future. But, you know, in the current situation, I think there should have been a negotiation, but not capitulation.
Okay,
I don't.
Sorry.
I don't see why we had to accept this, except especially the macro-linked bonds. This is, as many have said, Sri Lanka is the first to do it. You know, and why we should be the first, what is the advantage for us, is beyond me. The advantage is, of course, that this now gives the IMF a say in all future macroeconomic policy. Because from now on, they will be the adjudicators of what is good and what is bad governance, which will mean a huge difference for the repayment of that debt. So actually, Sri Lanka has now lost its economic sovereignty. And that is why I believe any future government has to immediately abrogate that agreement and say it was done by an illegal government, because the president is not a legitimate president. He was not elected by the people. And the people backing him were the ones also responsible in part for the problems. So I think a future government, they should do that. And as I've repeated many times, they should also look again at the Central Bank Act and change that dramatically. Because these are two things that have been done together with the privatizations of energy, which are going to hamstring Sri Lanka. They're basically going to put Sri Lanka into a situation that our destiny is no longer under our own control. Actually, it'll be the IMF from now on running Sri Lanka. And this is the only way a future government can get out of it. So having people in the opposition congratulating the president for what he has done means either that they don't understand economics, which is perfectly possible, or they're complicit in essentially transferring economic sovereignty out of the hands of the government, a government which they are destined to take over, incidentally,
So
or possibly.
Is this a trade-off of sovereignty and independence, and in return for prosperity and wealth?
I don't think there's any prosperity coming from it, Roshan, because there's no interest in the IMF making Sri Lanka prosperous. What is the interest for the IMF to do that? They were not set up to make developing countries prosperous. The only successful countries have actually followed policies that the IMF abhors. That is completely against, the industrialization policies. So why would the IMF now help Sri Lanka to industrialize?
So would you say the emerging economies that did well, like Ramsar the Tigers, etc., and arguably Bangladesh, have come through or are coming through despite the best efforts of the IMF? Or because some people say, if Sri Lanka was smarter, they would have made use of the IMF, gone to them earlier for a bailout rather than waiting for the economy to crash. So what do you say to such people that suggest that the IMF is there for Sri Lanka, and if Sri Lanka played a smarter game, you could actually benefit from them?
Well, the only countries that have actually done well are those that serve the geopolitical interests of the US. So if you look at all the successful East Asian countries, they played the anti-China card. And it was because of the anti-China position of the US that they helped those countries to actually prosper. If you look at the case of Taiwan as one of the best examples, literally the US held the hand of Taiwanese business people and suppressed the corruption of the Taiwanese officials to make Taiwan what it is today. They opened up their markets completely. To all the sub-Saharan African countries, the US imposed non-tariff barriers. Basically, anything else apart from raw materials, they blocked. So whenever any country tried to go down the industrial path, and they weren't part of the geopolitical game that the US was playing, they were blocked because they were very important for raw materials and basic foodstuffs. This is why I think when President Premadasa went down this path, he made a lot of Western governments incredibly nervous, because here was a country, small country, that showed it's perfectly possible to do what the successful East Asians did, going down this manufacturing path. And I think when you see what happened with the government that came into power straight after that, which was run by Bandaranaike, the first thing that she did was she essentially abandoned Premadasa's export-oriented industrialization strategy in return for support to end the war in the North and East. And she allowed for the privatization of the National Development Bank and basically the degradation of the Export Development Board, which had been so important and influential in the whole promotion of Sri Lanka's manufactured exports. Because this is what the advanced countries, this is the bargaining chip we will support you in a number of different ways, provided you don't go down this path. And you can see it repeated today, and it'll be repeated with a future government. So it's not going to be easy for a future government that wants to go down this path, because now not many people, let's put it this way, not many Western countries are in a position to concede any more to the developing world. You asked the question about BRICS. BRICS is the problem now for them. And they don't want anyone else joining with the BRICS if it means that they're going to move down the industrialization path. And I think that is the only way that a future Sri Lankan government could possibly be immune to the pressures of the West. It's by working with the BRICS, joining them, and doing lots of joint ventures with BRICS, with companies from BRICS countries.
Very interesting. It would appear that Sri Lanka, so what I'm getting from you is the idea that we've signed up for a US policy at a time when the trend is going the other way. I mean, let's first establish that the 3.9 or whatever small amount of money that the Sri Lankan government is getting is peanuts in the grand scheme of things. If you look at what Ukraine gets, it's hundreds of times more than what Sri Lanka is getting from the IMF. So it's all about control and much less about, the funds themselves. So Sri Lanka seems to have signed itself up on a road to nowhere, or at least guaranteed future default, when actually there's a opportunity that you mentioned with BRICS. And I think, the growth in the middle class of the BRICS countries, India itself, the neighbor, has something like 200 or 300 million people who have a comparable purchasing power of Western Europe, right? So that's like a market which, and it's still growing. So the BRICS, I think, does offer that. And at a time when the Global South seems to have taken up also the flag of the moral standards. It's very difficult to have any kind of discussion without making at least a reference to what's happening in the Middle East and in Palestine in particular. And what's been shown up in terms of the West is that they no longer have the moral upper ground, or if they ever had it, but it's certainly exposed. The emperor's naked, and the duplicity of it all is there for anyone with their eyes open to see very clearly. So here is an opportunity to maybe change direction. So let's hope that that there will be a change if that is the way that we feel would be better for Sri Lanka and Sri Lankans as a whole, as a country, which again, Sri Lanka is no different from, as you mentioned, Kenya and so many other countries who are in a very similar situation. Have I summed this up? Have I done justice to the amazing insights that you've shared, Howard?
I think so. From my perspective, it was spot on. I mean, the thing that we didn't touch on, but maybe we'll do that in a future podcast, is the global dimension and the implications of the Palestinian conflict for the way people are now going to think about the West in the future, and also what the US has done with respect to the sanctions on Russia and other activities of, basically now trying to block Chinese exports worldwide. by influencing even its trading partners like Europe to take similar measures against China. I think now, in a way, the gloves are off. And I think that the moral high ground definitely has been lost. I've been at a couple of international fora recently, and I can assure the people in the West that they have lost the moral high ground, because the issue of Palestine came up so often and was discussed as if it was accepted fact that the West was supporting a genocidal state without any reference to human rights or anything like that. So I think that part is really important. But equally important is the fact that when they are threatened by any other industrial power that they don't see as part of their orbit, they take draconian measures against that industrial power. So, if anyone wants to be outside of that orbit, they better think carefully now about the orbit in which they want to operate. So I think
so I hope I'm speaking for all of us when I say when we are criticizing the West, we are explicitly speaking about Western governments. I mean, you're sitting in the middle of Europe right now, and all of us spend a lot of our time in Europe, and I don't think we can in any way make the people, the citizens of the Western world complicit. Moreover, I think I have a higher respect for the citizens in the Western world, especially over what we have seen. They have been at the front line of protesting the genocidal goings on that we have, without a doubt, worst thing I've probably seen in my entire lifetime. And I'm a lot older than I look as well. So,
and the only candidates that they can choose from in their elections are all on one side of that spectrum.
Absolutely, Brian. This is what I was going to come to. So I feel the West, if there's a crime on the part of the Western citizen, average Joe Blog, is that they're sleepwalking into a very dangerous situation. And why do you think the hardship that the Western average person is facing since COVID, everyone's economic situation has certainly deteriorated in the Western world and in most parts of the world? Why do you think this is pushing the voter base in Western Europe, especially to the right? Whereas my common sense would make me reason that we should go to the left. If you worked hard all your life and you plan to be somewhere and the carpet's been, pulled from under your feet, you would tend to maybe listen to a few of the things that Marx has said about capitalism and the other rhetoric, and maybe reason that we need to move left in terms of who governs us to kind of give us a fair deal, the fruits of our labor. Why do you think it's gone to the right? Why do you think is it just about immigration? Or is that a tendency, and how dangerous is it? I know we're running out of time. There's a lot of talk that going to the right is a dangerous trend. What are your thoughts on it in the developed world?
Howard and I constantly have fierce debates about this, because he's from a time when there was, he's from a time when there was actually a clearly defined left and a clearly defined right. Whereas I'm, I guess, too young to hold on to concepts like that. So for me, it actually doesn't mean anything anymore. I mean, for me, the so-called left have completely abandoned the working class in a lot of their policies. And even though I have particular views on immigration, I think it should be recognized that this is actually one of the things that is, in a way, contributing to the economic hardships of the working class. Because when you have a lot of immigration coming in, that actually puts downward pressure on wages. My only issue with that story is if you are off promoting wars in foreign countries causing that immigration, then you have no right to actually block it. But that's something else. But I see the immigration thing as a part of a broader sort of move where the left has really been on almost every single issue impacting the working class has been on the wrong side. So, talk of the central bank, the central banks printing incredible amounts of money and transferring wealth to the rich from the poor. We see that actually, anyway, in the Netherlands, I know that the left has been very supportive of those policies. And in the US, the Democrats are supposed to be more on the left. Well, they have been very supportive of the central bank policies. Then we get to the whole climate change debate. The green policies have very much been to the detriment of the working class because, polluting manufacturing and agriculture is all seen as dirty. It's something we need to get rid of. And then we need to move to more expensive green energy, which is further increasing the cost for the working class. So I think a lot of these policies that the left, so-called left, have hitched their wagon to are actually very damaging to the working class, and the working class knows it, So they are, it's not that I think they actually particularly like the right wing. I mean, at least I get that sense, but it's just they are desperate for something else and desperate for someone to speak up for them. And they think they find it in people like Donald Trump, so that's why he is such a popular figure in the US, because so many working class people feel like he is in their camp. Whether he actually is a different thing altogether. Would have trouble arguing in favor of that given his previous term. But at least there is that sentiment, and understandably so, because if you listen to the things he said before coming in, he's going to clear the swamp out in Wall Street, get rid of all these elites that are sucking the lifeblood out of the American working class, all of these things where you could really get behind when you are a working class person. But then whether he actually managed to do anything about that is another thing. And same with immigration. Of course, he has that reputation of being very anti-immigration. Yet I believe the statistics actually prove that he didn't do much to stop immigration. All he did was build that wall, which was sort of like more like a monument, but it wasn't actually effective in stopping any immigration.
Oh, yes, thanks. At the risk of prolonging the debate and getting into trouble with my team, who are already giving me funny looks that I've overrun, why do you think Macron and Rishi Sunak called elections that they knew they were bound to lose at a time when, they would have been as certain can be that having a snap election would result in a disastrous outcome, which seems to, it's already proven in the UK as of this morning, and similarly in France. Do you think there's something going on? Should we be worried? Or it's just Rishi Sunak just wants to get back to the US and put his sunglasses and beach shorts and say bye-bye to the stress of running the UK. Any thoughts?
I am worried, but not for the reasons that you might be worried. I feel like they need a patsy. And they need a patsy because we are on the cusp of a monster global recession. That's my feeling. I think they have injected so much money and actually pushed production in the advanced countries well beyond its proper revenue base and tried to plug holes in the banking and financial system with all sorts of ad hoc measures, they know that the walls are on the verge of crumbling. And when they crumble, it's 2008 to 9 times 100, as it were. And they don't want to be there when those walls crumble. At least that's the impression I'm getting, because, really, why on earth did Sunak do that? If he really believed he had a chance and he could do something in the short term to bolster his image, Macron didn't need to call an election like this. And it's too much of a coincidence that it's exactly at the same time. And then we have this abysmal performance by Biden in the US in the discussion, where actually it beggars belief that they didn't know this was going to happen. I mean, I simply don't buy that. And the question is whether they also want Trump to be there when the dam bursts.
Well, I had a discussion about this with friends of mine as well. Are the Democrats really that stupid? That they went after Trump for those bogus charges, and actually immediately after he was convicted or whatever, his popularity soared. And then again, after this debate, what did they think was going to happen during that debate?
Especially after he had just pooed his pants at the D-Day celebration. I thought he did pretty well.
All of these things, I mean, are they actually serious with Biden? I actually believe that it's more to do with or less to do with who is the patsy when the whole thing comes crumbling down, and more to do with absolute control by, call it a deep state, where you make sure both the guys running in the race are your guys and no one else can come in. So actually, since 2016, they've been incredibly successful at this. Both of these have been presented as polar opposites. Whereas, seriously, looking at their policies, you can only conclude that they're very much the same. I mean, just look at the tariffs against China. Trump was supposed to be sort of the anti-trade, anti-globalist person. Biden, last year, goes and ramps up all those tariffs that he criticized Trump for putting in the first place.
Right.
They're exactly the same person. So whoever is pulling the strings is laughing his or her guts out, saying, I've created this image that where we have a democracy. There are these two polar opposites and you have to choose one or the other. And don't even think about any third party candidates. Don't think about the Green Party. Don't think about RFK Jr. No, don't consider any of that, just these two. And you can see that it works beautifully. Either you are afraid that Trump is going to bring the apocalypse, and that's why you're voting for Biden, or you, I guess correctly so, believe that Biden is almost on his way out and can't possibly run a country, so you're going to vote for Trump. And so this is the illusion of choice that you've been given, where you're actually choosing the same person.
I think you've actually hit the nail on the head there, Bram. I'm a bit curious as to what Howard was thinking, what my reason for asking the question was, but it was pretty much the same. But I also thought about the danger of Ukraine, the situation in Ukraine deteriorating. I think if there's any silver lining in all this madness is that if Trump comes in, the likelihood of that escalation will be doused pretty quickly, I believe, and he's able to do that. Whether that's in the interest of some of the crazy governments in Europe, we don't know, but it does seem like they're quite happy to play a very dangerous game in Ukraine. Was that what you were thinking, Howard? as part of the.
Actually, I also totally agree with what Brahm is saying. But what did strike me, and which I find truly bizarre, is I read the BBC's report on the French elections. And they said, on the one side, you've got a person that is going to actually give comfort to Putin, that is Marie Le Pen. And on the other side, you've got a left that's going to give Ukraine even more money than Macron did. The left, this is the Communist Party linked with all the other socialist parties. They're going to give the fascists in Ukraine even more money than Macron did. And I'm thinking to myself, this is insane. Here is the ultra-right actually saying they're not going to continue with this war in Ukraine. And the BBC condemning the ultra-right because of that and congratulating the ultra-left for wanting to bring us to the brink of World War III. And I'm thinking, how on earth have we gotten to this point in time? And I think this comes back to what you said, which is, and Brahma's repeated to me many times, he doesn't understand these labels of left and right anymore. What he does understand is issues and positions on issues, but nobody does that anymore. There's this blanket coverage of they're left. They must believe in this. They're right. They must believe in, they're baddies. Or these are the goodies, but the goodies are doing something that historically virtually everyone in the society was frightened of, which is nuclear Armageddon. So here are the left actually talking about arming the Ukrainians to the teeth and even allowing them to use all sorts of weapons against mainland Russia. So I was just astonished by that BBC report. I'm hoping that it was misinformation on the part of the BBC. So I'm quite busy looking to see the verification of this.
Right, this is a rare moment when you and Bram have managed to agree on something. So perhaps it's an auspicious moment on which to conclude a really fascinating session, and we didn't even touch on most of the things that I had down that I thought we were going to talk about. But what we did discuss, I feel, was excellent, and it obviously identified many problems and looked at some of the ways out of it. Would you guys like a 30-second wrap on what we can expect this year in terms of, it's election fever year around the world. Things are unfolding. A quick 30-second before my team evicts me from the office.
Seniors first.
Well, one of the things that we have been discussing and looking at, which we didn't really get to in any significant way, is the possibility for a major rupture in the global economy. It doesn't mean to say it's irreversible collapse, that this is the final stage of capitalism in the world, but rather it's probably something that is very necessary given the dramatic and fundamental changes in the technology base of the world. But it's a collapse which is long overdue, and which of course will have important implications for Sri Lanka, given that now a lot of people do understand that we're at least marginally linked to the world economy, even if they don't believe that we're linked in a fundamental way.
Thank you, Howard. Over to you, Bram.
Yeah, he stole my point, actually.
You started agreeing now. This is worrying.
Yeah, that's when it gets boring. No, nothing much to add. I think that is, I mean, it's another gap in the understanding of economics that most of the policymakers here are stuck with, right? It's that they don't see that global recessions and global downturns are actually something that reoccurs in a constant cycle, and that is actually something you need to take into account when you're setting policy. So I wonder if any of the governments are actually prepared for something like that again. I mean, we saw that they were completely caught off guard by COVID and the global recession that hit us during that time. But, you know, going forward, the measures that they put in place where they've made it really difficult for the government to spend money to counter any weakness in the economy, and to also reduce interest rates briefly when necessary to also alleviate some of the stress in financial markets. That mechanism has been really damaged. So I think, you know, this is part of the problem, as not seeing global recessions, but also moments of periods of economic weakness in Sri Lanka actually being something that recurs all the time and something you need to take into account when you're setting policy.
Excellent. So fasten your seatbelts for the rest of 2024. Seems to be the message. Gentlemen,
well, we're projecting for next year. So.
Oh, okay, you've got one step ahead. We'll get back to the COVID issue hopefully next week when we see you all again. And yeah, so I'll let you get on with the rest of your days. Thank you so much. It's been amazing. See you next time.
Thanks, Roshan. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Roshan. Fantastic.
Good one. Cheers.